Now, find a comfortable place to sit back and relax. Perhaps you're listening at the end of a long day. Perhaps you're winding down for the evening. Or perhaps you're simply curious about a forgotten moment from history. Whatever brought you here, take a deep breath, settle in, and let the noise of the modern world fade into the background. Tonight, I am going to tell you the story of one of the greatest urban disasters of the 19th century. It began with a small flame. Not a thunderbolt. Not an act of war. Just a fire, the kind that could start anywhere, at any time, in any city in Europe in the 19th century. A spark in the wrong place, at the wrong hour, on the wrong night. But this fire would not stay small. Over 3 days in May 1842, fire consumed the heart of Hamburg, one of the wealthiest and most important trading cities in the world. More than a third of the old city was reduced to ash. Thousands lost their homes. Hundreds of years of history burned in hours. And yet, Hamburg did not fall. It rebuilt. Faster, smarter, and in ways that would shape the modern city you can still visit today. This is the story of how a single fire changed everything. This is the Great Fire of Hamburg. To understand what burned, you first need to understand what Hamburg was. By 1842, Hamburg was not just a city. It was one of the great commercial engines of Europe, a free city, politically independent, answering to no king or emperor. For centuries it had governed itself as a republic of merchants, and those merchants had made it rich. Sit the city on a map and you understand why. Hamburg lies where the Alster River meets the Elbe, and the Elbe flows out to the North Sea. This made Hamburg a natural gateway, the point where goods from the interior of Europe met the ships bound for Britain, the Americas, and the wider world. Grain, timber, textiles, spices, sugar, it all passed through Hamburg. The city's docks were never quiet. By the early 19th century, Hamburg had grown into a city of roughly 130,000 people. Wealthy merchants lived in grand townhouses along the canals. Craftsmen and traders filled the narrow streets of the inner city. Sailors, dockworkers, and immigrants crowded into the older districts near the water. It was dense, prosperous, and alive with commerce. But beneath the wealth, Hamburg carried a serious problem, one that the city had been slow to address. It was built to burn. The oldest parts of the city were medieval in their bones. Streets so narrow that two people could barely pass each other. Buildings leaning toward one another across alleyways, their upper floors almost touching. And the construction, timber-framed, wood-paneled, with rooftops of dry thatch or weathered shingles stacked together like dry kindling waiting for a match. The canals that ran through the city were picturesque. They were also, in certain winds, completely useless for fighting fires. Water needed to be pumped. Equipment needed to be dragged through streets too tight for a cart. And fire, once started in a city like this, did not wait. There had been warnings before. Hamburg had suffered fires in earlier centuries, destructive ones, costly ones. Every major European city of that era had its fire stories. And every time, the city rebuilt, patched, and continued as before. The lessons were learned and then quietly forgotten, because change was expensive and the city was busy making money. The fire brigades existed, but they were poorly coordinated, a patchwork of guild-based volunteer companies each responsible for their own district, without a central command or a shared plan. Equipment was outdated. Training was inconsistent. And the city's insurance companies, though active, had more interest in paying out claims after the fact than in funding prevention before it. Hamburg in 1842 was, in short, a city that had outgrown its medieval infrastructure while retaining all of its medieval vulnerabilities. The spring of 1842 had been dry. Unusually so. Weeks had passed without significant rain, and the old wooden buildings of the inner city had soaked up the dryness the way timber does, quietly, invisibly, becoming more dangerous with every passing day. On the evening of the 4th of May, the city went to sleep as it always did. Candles were extinguished. Hearths were banked. The night watchmen made their rounds through the narrow streets, lanterns swinging in the dark. Somewhere in the Dijkstrasse, the old street that ran alongside the canal, something went wrong. The exact cause has never been established with certainty. Some accounts point to a spark from an open fire. Others suggest a candle left unattended. What is known is this: shortly after midnight on the 5th of May 1842, a fire was spotted in a building near the canal. By the time anyone raised the alarm, it had already taken hold. The wind was blowing from the south, and the old city of Hamburg lay directly in its path. The alarm was raised just after midnight. A watchman spotted the glow first, an orange flicker in the upper floor of a building on the Dijkstrasse, the long row of merchants' warehouses that lined the inner canal. He rang the bell. Others followed. Within minutes, the night was filled with the sound of running feet and shouted warnings echoing off stone walls. But fire does not wait for people to organize themselves. The building where the fire started was typical of the Dijkstrasse: tall, narrow, timber-framed, packed tightly against its neighbors on either side. The ground floor served as storage for goods in transit. The upper floors were living quarters, offices, the accumulated clutter of a working merchant household. Dry wood everywhere. And above it all, a roof of old shingles baked by weeks of dry spring weather. The first fire company arrived within the hour. Then a second. Then a third. By the standards of the time, the response was not slow. But the fire had already crossed from the first building to the second, and from the second to the third, moving along the row of warehouses the way fire moves through connected timber, hungrily, and with purpose. The wind was the real enemy that night. A strong southerly had been building through the evening, and as the fire grew it created its own weather, drawing air inward, throwing sparks upward and outward in long arcs that landed on rooftops 50, 100 meters away. Each new spark was a new fire. Each new fire spread to its neighbors. The firefighters, already stretched thin along the Dijkstrasse, now found themselves responding to outbreaks on streets they had not yet reached. Hamburg's firefighting system was showing its weaknesses in real time. The volunteer companies each protected their own district, a system that worked well enough for an isolated house fire, but was completely unsuited to a blaze of this scale. There was no central command. No one with the authority to direct all companies at once, to make the hard decisions about where to concentrate resources and where to let buildings burn in order to save others. Companies worked alongside each other but not together. Orders were given, contradicted, and ignored in the chaos. The water supply was another problem. Hamburg's canals were full, but getting water from them to the fire required hand-operated pumps, slow, labor-intensive, and prone to failure when pushed beyond their limits. The pressure was never enough. The hoses, where they existed, were short. Firefighters worked at the edges of the blaze rather than inside it, unable to get close enough to make a real difference. As the first hours of the 5th of May passed, it became clear to anyone watching that this was not a fire that would be contained before dawn. People began to flee. In the streets around the Dijkstrasse, families poured out of their homes carrying whatever they could, bundles of clothing, boxes of papers, children still half asleep. The streets became rivers of people moving away from the light and the heat. Carts were pressed into service. Neighbors helped neighbors. Some went to relatives on the other side of the city. Others simply stopped at a safe distance and watched, unable to leave, as the skyline they had known all their lives began to glow orange against the dark sky. The city's leadership was awake by now. Senators and officials gathered in the town hall, receiving reports and trying to understand the scale of what was happening. Requests went out to neighboring cities for additional firefighting equipment. Messengers rode through the night. But help, even when it came, would take hours, and the fire was not waiting. By the time the sun rose on the morning of the 5th of May, the Dijkstrasse was gone. And the fire was still spreading. What had started as a single building burning in the night had become something else entirely, a wall of flame moving through the oldest and most densely built part of the city, fed by centuries of dry timber, fanned by a wind that showed no sign of dropping, and entirely beyond the ability of Hamburg's firefighters to stop. The worst was still to come. The second day was worse than the first. By the morning of the 5th of May, the fire had moved beyond the Dijkstrasse and into the dense web of streets that made up the heart of Old Hamburg. The Nikolaikirche, the great Gothic church that had stood at the center of the city for 5 centuries, was directly in the fire's path. So were the streets around the town hall, the exchange buildings, the warehouses of some of Hamburg's most powerful trading houses. Additional fire companies had arrived from neighboring towns by now. Altena sent men and equipment. Lübeck dispatched pumps. Prussia offered soldiers to help with crowd control and the movement of salvaged goods. For the first time, Hamburg had more hands than it had started with, but it was still not enough. The fundamental problem had not changed. The streets were too narrow, the buildings too close together, and the wind too steady. Every time firefighters managed to slow the advance on one front, a shower of sparks would leap over their lines and ignite something 50 meters behind them. The fire did not advance in a single wall, it jumped, skipped, doubled back. It was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pin down. A decision was made that would be remembered for years afterward. To stop a fire of this size, you cannot simply fight it from the edges. You have to create a gap, a firebreak, a stretch of empty ground that the flames cannot cross. This means demolishing buildings that have not yet caught fire. It means destroying the homes and businesses of people who have done nothing wrong, in the hope that the sacrifice will save everything else. It is a brutal calculation. And in Hamburg in May 1842, it was made too slowly. The city's leadership hesitated. Property rights in Hamburg were taken seriously. This was a city built by merchants, for merchants, and the idea of ordering the demolition of a man's warehouse before the fire had even reached it sat uneasily with the men making the decisions. By the time the order came to begin systematic demolition, the fire had already outrun the plan. Buildings were blown up with gunpowder in an attempt to create fire breaks. Some worked. Others simply scattered burning debris across a wider area, starting new fires in places that had been safe. The explosions shook the ground and sent columns of smoke and dust into a sky already thick with ash. Through the second day and into the second night, the fire burned. Those who were there described the experience in terms that are difficult to read even now. The heat was felt streets away, a wall of warmth pushing against you even when the flames themselves were out of sight. The noise was constant, the roar of the fire itself, the crack and groan of timbers giving way, the crash of walls collapsing inward. And over it all, the wind, still blowing, still carrying sparks northward through the city. The Nikolaikirche fell on the evening of the 5th of May. The tower, which had been one of the tallest structures in northern Europe, burned from the top down, glowing like a torch against the night sky before the spire collapsed in a cascade of burning wood and stone. People who watched from the surrounding countryside said the light was visible for miles. By the third day, the 6th of May, the fire was beginning, at last, to slow. Not because it had been defeated, but because it was running out of things to burn. The densest parts of the old city had already been consumed. The fire breaks that had been created, some by demolition, some simply by the absence of buildings in the fire's path, were beginning to hold. The wind, too, was dropping. Not gone, but weaker than it had been on that first terrible night. On the 7th of May, the fire was declared under control. Hamburg surveyed what remained. The numbers, when they were finally counted, were staggering. More than a third of the inner city had been destroyed, roughly 1,700 buildings reduced to rubble and ash. Around 20,000 people had lost their homes. The financial losses were enormous, running into tens of millions of marks at a time when Hamburg's entire annual budget was a fraction of that figure. Churches, warehouses, the exchange, the town hall, all gone or severely damaged. And yet, and this is the part that matters, the death toll was remarkably low. Estimates vary, but most historians put the number of direct fatalities at somewhere between 50 and 100 people in a city of 130,000. The evacuation, chaotic as it was, had worked. The warnings had spread fast enough. Hamburg had lost its buildings, but it had not lost its people. The city was in shock. But it was alive. And in the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to happen in the ruins. The silence after a great fire is its own kind of shock. When the flames finally died and the smoke began to thin, the people of Hamburg walked back into streets they no longer recognized. The landmarks they had known since childhood were gone. Churches reduced to hollow shells. Warehouses collapsed into themselves. Streets that had been narrow before were now open to the sky, framed by broken walls and the blackened stumps of timber beams. The smell lingered for weeks, wet ash, scorched stone, the particular heaviness of a city that has burned. For the 20,000 people who had lost their homes, the immediate reality was desperate. Hamburg in the summer of 1842 was a city of improvised shelters and borrowed rooms. Families crowded into the houses of relatives. Churches opened their halls. The city organized emergency housing in the districts that had been spared, but there were far more people without homes than there were places to put them. Some left Hamburg entirely, moving to other cities or emigrating, adding to the steady flow of Germans who were already leaving for America in those years. The economic damage was almost incomprehensible. Hamburg was, above all else, a trading city. Its wealth lived in its warehouses, its counting houses, its exchange. All of that had burned. The records of debts and credits, contracts and agreements, much of it gone. Merchants who had been wealthy on the 4th of May woke on the 8th to find themselves ruined, their stock destroyed, their premises ash, their paperwork unrecoverable. Insurance existed. Hamburg had a relatively developed insurance market for its time, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed it. Companies that had been perfectly solvent before the fire found themselves facing claims they could not pay. Some collapsed entirely. Others paid partial settlements and survived. The process of sorting out who owed what to whom would take years and fill courts with litigation. Beyond the individual losses, the city itself faced a financial crisis. Hamburg's government had to borrow heavily, from other German states, from foreign banks, from anyone willing to lend, just to begin the work of clearing the rubble and maintaining basic services. The city's credit, built up over generations of careful financial management, was tested as it had never been tested before. And yet, here is the thing about Hamburg, the city did not collapse into despair. Within days of the fire being extinguished, the debates had already begun. Not just about how to clear the rubble, but about what to build in its place. Hamburg's merchant class was practical above all else. They had lost everything once. They had no intention of losing it again. The questions being asked in the counting houses and council chambers of Hamburg in the summer of 1842 were pointed ones. Why had the fire spread so fast? Why had the fire brigades been unable to stop it? Why had the streets been so narrow that equipment could not pass? Why had the buildings been so close together that a spark in one became a fire in all? The answers were uncomfortable. Hamburg had known about these problems for years. Reports had been written. Warnings had been issued. And the city had, each time, found reasons to delay, because rebuilding costs money, and because the people who would have paid for change were the same people who profited from the existing arrangement. The fire had settled the argument. There would be no rebuilding the old Hamburg. Not because no one wanted to, plenty of people did, particularly those who owned the land and wanted their warehouses back as quickly as possible. But the city's leadership had looked at the ruins and understood something important: the opportunity to change everything came only once. If they rebuilt as before, the same disaster would happen again. If they rebuilt differently, Hamburg could become something new. The question was what that something new should look like. And for that, Hamburg would turn to an Englishman. His name was William Lindley, and he was 29 years old when he arrived in Hamburg. Lindley was a British civil engineer, part of a generation of men who had grown up alongside the railways, the sewers, and the water mains that were beginning to transform the cities of Britain. He had come to Hamburg before the fire, hired to help with a modest project involving the city's drainage. He was still there when the fire broke out. And when the smoke cleared, Hamburg's leaders realized they had exactly the right man in exactly the right place. They gave him an extraordinary commission: help us rebuild the city. Not patch it. Not restore it. Rebuild it, from the ground up, on modern principles, in a way that would make it safe, functional, and fit for the century ahead. Lindley threw himself into the work. The first task was the most unglamorous: clearing the rubble. Tens of thousands of tons of burned timber, collapsed masonry, and ash had to be removed before anything else could happen. Workers, many of them the same people who had lost their homes in the fire, were employed in the clearing gangs. It was hard, dirty, slow work. The ruins were still warm in places when they began. Some areas had to be left untouched for weeks simply because the ground beneath them was too unstable to walk on safely. But even as the clearing work proceeded, Lindley was drawing plans. The new Hamburg would have wider streets, wide enough for fire engines to pass, wide enough for carts to move freely, wide enough to prevent fire from leaping easily from one side to the other. The new buildings would be built in brick and stone, not timber. There would be proper setbacks between structures. The densest and most dangerous tangles of medieval alleyways would not be rebuilt at all, replaced instead with open squares and broader thoroughfares. But Lindley's most lasting contribution was not the streets or the buildings. It was what lay beneath them. Hamburg's old water supply had been a patchwork of wells, cisterns, and canal water, unreliable, often contaminated, and completely inadequate for fighting a major fire. Lindley designed a modern waterworks system: a central pumping station, iron mains running beneath the new streets, hydrants at regular intervals throughout the city. For the first time, firefighters in Hamburg would have access to pressurized water wherever they needed it. He also designed a new sewer system, something that would have consequences far beyond fire safety. Hamburg's old sewage arrangements were, like those of most European cities of the time, deeply inadequate. Waste drained into the canals. Drinking water came from the same canals. The result was disease, recurring outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery that killed hundreds of people every year, mostly quietly, mostly among the poor, mostly unnoticed by the merchant class that ran the city. Lindley's sewers would not fully solve this problem, that would take another generation, but they were the beginning of a modern urban infrastructure that Hamburg had never had before. The rebuilding took years. It was not smooth or simple. There were arguments about compensation for landowners whose property had been compulsorily acquired to widen streets. There were disputes about building standards, about costs, about which neighborhoods to prioritize. Some people rebuilt quickly on their old plots, before the new plans were finalized, and had to be argued with or bought out. The process was messy, political, and expensive. But it moved forward. By the late 1840s, the broad outlines of a new Hamburg were visible in the streets. New brick warehouses stood where timber once had burned. Wider roads cut through what had been a medieval tangle. The new exchange, grander than the old one, rose near the center of the rebuilt district. The city was not yet finished, and would not be for many years, but it was clearly becoming something different from what it had been. Hamburg was rebuilding. And it was rebuilding better. What nobody knew yet, not Lindley, not the city's senators, not the merchants overseeing the reconstruction of their warehouses, was that the underground infrastructure being laid beneath the new streets would face its most important test not in a fire, but in a plague. That test was still 50 years away. But it was coming. And perhaps that is the lasting legacy of the Great Fire of Hamburg. Not the destruction itself. Not the thousands of buildings that vanished into smoke. Not even the fortunes that were lost. Its true legacy was transformation. Disasters often reveal what years of prosperity allow people to ignore. The weaknesses hidden beneath success. the vulnerabilities buried beneath routine. The uncomfortable truths that seem too expensive, too inconvenient, or too difficult to confront. For decades, Hamburg had known its streets were too narrow. It knew its firefighting systems were outdated. It knew its infrastructure belonged to an earlier age. But change is easy to postpone. Until suddenly it is not. The fire of 1842 forced Hamburg to make decisions it had avoided for generations. It destroyed homes, businesses, churches, and landmarks. Yet in doing so, it also created the opportunity to build something new. The city that emerged from the ashes was safer, healthier, and better prepared for the future than the city that had burned. The wider streets, the modern water supply, the new sewer system, and the improved urban planning would shape Hamburg for decades to come. Few of the people watching the flames in May 1842 could have imagined that. In the moment, all they could see was loss. History often works that way. Those living through great events rarely understand their full significance. They experience fear, uncertainty, and disruption. Only later do historians step back and see the larger picture. Today, visitors walking through Hamburg may pass through streets rebuilt after the fire without realizing it. The scars have faded. The city has long since recovered. But beneath the bricks and beneath the pavement lies the legacy of those 3 days in May. A reminder that cities, like people, are often shaped as much by their disasters as by their successes. And that sometimes, from the ashes of catastrophe, something stronger can emerge. Thank you for listening. And until next time, rest well.